Best Boy Adventurine's kit has been leaked by Hoyoverse themselves. For a short while, we had a chance to play him during the story, so I'm sure you're all riddled with questions regarding the inner workings of this beautiful blonde's kit. Well, that's what I'm here to break down for you today. And later, I'm going to cover his best teams, some build options, and also my thoughts on his pros and cons. Alright, let's start with his kit. Dude is an imaginary preservation unit who has quite some similarities to Gepard, but of course, in the plain old Honkai tradition, Aventurine is gonna have a big leg up over him. Starting with his normals, they are already different from most of our sustain units. Instead of scaling with attack like everybody and their grandmother, Best Boy's bonks scale with defense percent. This is incredible because you want to build def for his sustaining as well, meaning that he'll be able to contribute some mild damage to the team. He wants crits, unlike Pink Xiao, so unlike her, his normals will actually be worth a damn. His skill, Cornerstone Deluxe, is where his meat is. And his follow-ups. We will be going there in a second. It provides all his allies with a so-called fortified wager shield that scales with defense. It's about half as strong as Gepard's shield, but unlike him, it can be casted more often with his skill. On top, it can stack up to about double of its strength when you cast the skill again, which finally puts it at about Gepard's strength. This can be useful if you expect a lot of damage incoming at once. This shield will last you for 3 turns, so pay attention to how often your teammates go, or you will be in for a rude awakening when your Taemyeon with her global taunt gets smacked to death. Talking about shielding power, Aventurine has more access to defense than Gepard from his build, and therefore can have even slightly beefier shields. I'm going to talk about that in the build section. Aventurine's ultimate, Roulette Shark, is a single target nuke that deals imaginary damage and also scales with his defense. But it doesn't just deal damage, but also helps him to generate 1 to 7 stacks of blind bet randomly for his follow-up attacks. But more importantly, the burst also applies a vulnerability debuff to a single enemy for 3 turns. What it does is whenever a teammate deals a critical strike to an enemy, the enemy will take more damage from that hit. So don't get bamboozled when it mentions crit damage, as this is not a straight up crit damage increase. It is an increase to the amount of crit damage that you deal. So if you deal a hit and it doesn't crit, that's not getting buffed by his burst debuff. Shot Loaded is Aventurine's talent, and that one is packed. Whenever shields are up on your team, everyone gets a whopping 50% effect res. This is pretty nice, as that will automatically get any support who uses the broken kill set guaranteed over the 30% threshold. But, more importantly, it will be very useful to protect your team from crowd control debuffs. Aventurine himself can completely negate crowd control debuffs once, and then once every 2 turns, much like how Fu Shuan does it, so that is crucial to prevent your team ending up in the blue screen of death. But that isn't all with the goodies. Whenever anyone out of your team gets hit by an enemy, when they have Aventurine's shield up, they will generate a blind bet stack for Aventurine's follow-up attacks. It doesn't matter if multiple are hit at the same time, each of them will generate stacks. Once you reach 7 stacks, Aventurine will unpack his big boy follow-up attack, unleashing a 7-hit combo on a random enemy. I am that random enemy. Anyways, this ability, like all his others, does deal imaginary damage and scales with defense. Interestingly, his stack counter goes up to 10, not to 7. Overcapping can easily happen, especially when multiple people are hit or after he uses his burst. In these cases, the overfill stacks are similar to Acheron. They get transferred to the next follow-up. This allows Aventurine to unpack multiple follow-up attacks in a pretty quick fashion. Pretty good so far. His technique is pretty solid. It gives your whole team a buff to their defense, and it comes down to chance if you get the base buff, the medium buff, or the maximum deluxe buff. You can check this yourself after going into battle by looking at the buffs menu by pressing C. There's no point in continuously rolling technique points on him to try and get the max buff, since even his base buff will be solid. Also, stacking isn't a thing here, so to save technique points, do his last. But remember, it's all or nothing. Only by setting aside reason do you truly gamble. Now, his big details are not allowed to be seen in the trace menu. You can have a little look at them if you go into the little battle menu that lets you see all your buffs, and you can get a brief description of what everything does. But for finer details, you'll have to pay attention to the gameplay. One major thing that's easily noticeable is that anytime your teammates with a shield on launch a follow-up attack, Aventurine gets another stack to his blind bet. but you can only get 3 at max from the team until Aventurine takes his next turn. Another really important thing is that whenever Aventurine himself deals a follow-up attack, you can see the shields on teammates being fortified. The effect is not as strong as that from his skill, but it is noticeable, and the unit who has the weakest shield gets an even stronger boost to their shields. Another very interesting thing that comes from his traces is his crit rate. The dude gets a flat out 40% crit rate increase, which scales from his defense, as you can see in his stats. So this gives a strong incentive to give his damage some consideration. You only need that with a crit damage body to get him going. And he also always gets me going just by looking at him. Another thing that is easily noticeable is that whenever a new battle starts, the entire team gets a shield right away, and that is not dependent on Aventurine using technique points unlike Gepard. So far, it's clear that Aventurine is a far shot from a pure sustain unit like Locha or Gepard. You clearly get some offensive abilities from his own damage and the vulnerability he adds to a main target. The way his kit is positioned gives you incentive to play him with other follow-up attackers, but it's only an edge, not the whole package. At his core, he is still a sustain unit and technically useful in any team except Blades. That guy's on the unreachable side, don't bother, because whenever he gets attacked with a shield, he does not build any talent stacks, and that is why shielders are bad with him in general. As you might have guessed, the Wombo Combo, Aventurine my beloved, Topaz my beloved, and SAS Perkippy will be best in slot, and even more so when you put on Elation in the simulated universe. You guys are not ready for that. But yeah, in this team he can play to all his strengths. But outside of them, any type of crit-based team will see huge benefits. For example, Acheron, the Galaxy Ranger. With the vulnerability debuff, she can nuke the chunkiest guy on the field even faster. Plus that same debuff adds stacks for Acheron herself. And of course, since Blonde Boy is a preservation unit, he can make a ton of use out of the Universal Market Light Cone and get even more stacks for Acheron, but of course, that will sacrifice his own personal damage, keep that in mind. So a really good choice for that team. You can also pair him with Jingliu, Imbibitor Lune, and I would say he's definitely good for Imbibitor Lune. You can also opt to lower his own personal damage by running him on 2-piece Penacony, and this tactic also works for Dr. Ratio. It will be a solid increase to both of those teams. And while there are way better picks for non-Acheron DOT teams, you can still put him there and have some benefit. Mostly from the elemental coverage you gain, and of course from the sustain. But he will not, in 1,000 years, beat Huo there. He might be a slight upgrade over the likes of Bailu and Locha, as he makes your team take crowd control, debuffs, plus he adds his own damage. And he will be a worse Fu Shuan in terms of sustain. So definitely usable, but not a priority pick. Another thing I'd like to say that Huo has over Aventurine in DOT teams is that Huo's burst provides an attack buff to the entire party, and not only that, but she can hold 2-piece Penacony, which is a really big damage increase for Black Swan over just using something like Fleet of the Ageless, or Broken Keel, which is practically useless in those teams. One thing we know so far is that Aventurine won't need speed in his build. It's useful, but he can get away without it. It's likely thought that we will not see 100% uptime on his debuff, as he will take his sweet 4 turns to get his ult back. However, now, you could put 3 defense pieces on his relics and a body for crit damage, and since he boosts his own crit rate, you will now have a good amount of damage coming from his side, plus pretty beefy shields on top. To get him to 100% uptime, you would need to build an ERR rope and speed boots, which will certainly weaken his defensive capabilities. And as of now, I don't think this is the optimal way of playing him. It's better to just time the bulk of your team's damage in that 3-turn window of Aventurines to deal with a boss and have better survival on top. For example, against Aventurine himself. His crit rate increase is also very affected by the amount of defense you build, so the incentive here is clearly on building more defense over speed and energy recharge. Now in terms of relics, it's certainly great news for all of you that you do not need to throw away your Pioneer Diver defense pieces with double crit on them. I'm hoping you haven't done that already out of rage when farming for Acheron. Aventurine can easily abuse this set and deal more damage that way. Plus, a lot of you Acheron mains, spending time in that domain anyway, get double the benefit from this place. But of course, you can still go with more defensive options like Wuthering Snow or Purity Palace. But who in their right mind still farms these domains? And also, we established that Aventurine's benefit is in him not being a purely defensive unit, so these choices kinda remove that purpose. For his 2 pieces, You can either go for Broken Keel, or you can go for 2-piece Penacony if you're playing him with Dr. Ratio or Imbibitor Lune for the sake of support. I will say that since everyone has Dr. Ratio, and that Imbibitor Lune is a top 3 DPS, it is definitely worth using 2-piece Penacony in those comps. However, if you don't feel like farming for 2 sets, then you can just use Broken Keel across all teams, that will also be fine. But if you want your best boy to do more damage, then go ahead and build 2-piece Inert Salcedo on him. Both choices have their merit, it just depends on what you value more. Now, so far we have covered his kit and mostly discussed what Aventurine brings to the table, but he isn't free of any cons, so for anybody who's on the fence, you should definitely listen to this part here to make up your mind. One clear con with Aventurine is that you do not have any kind of emergency sustain. You will have to wait his turn to apply a shield or hope for a follow-up attack to happen to get your unit saved. There are quite a few characters that have a follow-up attack that you might have forgotten about, namely for example like Kafka in a DOT team, where let's say you're using Aventurine's normal attack to generate some skill points or contribute a bit of damage, well then Kafka will launch a small follow-up attack and there you go, that's another stack. But even so, there are quite a few units who don't have any kind of follow-up attack, and the top 3 DPSs right now, Acheron, Jingliu, and Dan Heng, generally don't have follow-ups in their team. But if you get a sudden burst of damage, or the shield just happens to run out, like with Tingyun in the story, you will get bamboozled. You have to pay a lot of attention with how often your teammates go, as there is no indicator as to how many turns their shields have left. We can only hope that they'll add a counter, as that would be a massive quality of life change. You have no full-on anti-crowd control for your teammates, you get a big effectorize buff, but it will not fully prevent your team from being crowd controlled. You also do not get a cleanse to remove a stun, so this might end up as a source for some annoying resets. You won't see a 100% uptime on this ultimate debuff. You will have to make a decision for going speed and energy recharge, but risk having less damage from him and a more squishy team. Or you go for more defense from your rope and boots and deal more damage and have a much beefier team. You cannot eat your cake here and keep it. I will eat Aventurine's cake though. It's an inconvenience, but my best bet here is to go the defensive route. This is what his kit incentivizes you to do, and if you're pulling for Aventurine, you're pulling a sustain unit, not a debuffer. The next thing is a nitpick, but while Aventurine is kind to your skill point economy, he is not strictly skill point positive. The IPC has to make money somehow. You still need to use his skill fairly frequently to keep the shields up and running. Obviously, you don't need him if you have 2 sustain units, of the likes of Xuan, Lucha, and Huohuo. Japard is also sufficient, but if you want a decent upgrade to him that serves you best in follow-up teams, then Aventurine will be your man, and he will be decent for Acheron and in general crit teams. So for everybody else who already has at least 2 solid sustainers, he is good, but the only need I can see for this unit is because he is super hot. But if you're immune to his charms, you can sit this one out unless you absolutely want him, for good reasons, look at him, and don't care about pull value on your account. But if you only have 1 5-star sustain unit, then yeah, I'd pick up Aventurine. It will be massive quality of life having 2 5-star sustain units. In my opinion, in Star Rail, the first 2 5-stars you should go for are sustain units. So if you haven't filled that quota, fill it when you can. Otherwise, Lynx will still be okay for your second half if you're in that position but you don't really want Aventurine. This has been Juice, signing out, and my toughness bar has been shattered since Aventurine makes me feel weak.